ladies and gentlemen, this is the birthday party of the European Chamber of Commerce. The 20th birthday is going to happen in October, and we have a friends in order to celebrate with us. We had already 5 rounds of discussions today. It's a special event with a couple of friends and also my former boss or my boss. Cecilia Malmström, the former Commissioner for Trade, and Pascal Lamy, equally the guy who brought Europe and China and WTO together. And then it's a pleasure for me, of course, to have my first BASF boss, Jürgen Hambrecht, on the line. He's now chairman of the Supervisory Board, a man with whom I shared many hours in China in the trenches. We have decided to pool these 3 in order to have a very good storyline of looking back, at the same time, of course, focusing on WTO in particular, as Pascal was also heading WTO for a while. And then, of course, going into the storyline of China, why big investment, why then, why now? And then, of course, WTO today, is China compliant? As you know, the papers are getting bigger and bigger. And along these lines. So first of all, we have a little bit of a commercial. We are having a website, Advocating for the Future stands for the Chamber, and we show basically our last 20 years of what has been achieved. Again, founded in 2000 by 51 people, and we had a couple of great success stories in building up to 1,700 members. In 2001, which is 19 years ago, we had the first position paper, and from there onward, we came out with lots of others papers. We are a paper machinery here. The point is that we are trying to show you what we are doing, but also linking you with the future. And you will see this website, I think, goes live later today or next week. And I hope you enjoy it, and you have then also the chance to contact us as indicated. So maybe I just start, ladies first, with Cecilia. Just a bit sort of on looking back, and as you have been at the forefront of these negotiations with China, and you had to deal with this robust negotiation style of some individuals there. Looking back, what was striking for you in comparison to other countries? If you concluded so many FTAs in your term, what was striking you was different with the Chinese interlocutors?
Well, thank you. Good morning or good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, depending on where you are, and a very happy birthday to the Chamber. Thank you for organizing this. Well, I think every country you negotiate with is different. Of course, China, with its huge, long history and pride, it is a country that is a little bit more specific than many others. I mean, one of the gigantic economic powers. And I think China all the time really wanted deep down a free trade agreement with the European Union. And did not really overcome the fact that the European Union said that, yes, that is a goal on the long term, but for the moment, let's first try to create a better level playing field and start with an investment agreement. And I think there somewhere it went a bit, we were different expectations. So I was a little bit sad to see that China has not engaged as much as we would have wanted, because I think this could have been, we have our differences and we have disagreements, but getting this investment agreement further would have really facilitated trade and cleared out some of these obstacles. And we're not there yet. We've been negotiating for many years, 7 years actually, but I was a bit surprised that China did not really engage in this, because I think it would have been good for China as well to diversify and to show that they can actually make this agreement with the European Union, paving a way for deeper engagement. Now, of course, there's been a lot of disagreements and a lot of difficulties in this relationship. We might come back to that later in this discussion. But that was striking and a bit disappointing for me as well, because we wonder, how can we convince China that this is actually a mutually beneficial agreement. Now, there was a formal decision that we would try to wrap this up later this fall. For different reasons, probably that big meeting in Leipzig will not take place for the coronavirus. But even if it had, or even it's still not formally cancelled, I don't think we would have finished the negotiations by then.
Yeah. Very telling, Cecilia. This morning, Li Keqiang gave his government report to the just about opened NPC, and in his speech, he referred to possible FTA with Korea and Japan, and Europe was not. So that is quite actually sobering to look at. Well,
but it is strange because, as you said, the European Union have concluded lately agreements with Japan, with Canada, with Singapore. Vietnam is entering into force in only a couple of weeks. I think there's only a formal decision pending in the Vietnamese parliament. We have concluded with Mexico, with Mercosur. I mean, the European Union is still a very attractive partner with the biggest internal market in the world. So it's sad to hear this reference you made this morning that Europe wasn't even mentioned.
Well, I mean, it's also very telling that you concluded FTA after FTA with the heavy hitters, with a notable exception, of course, in China. And at the same time, we are talking about an investment agreement, which, of course, in scope and in essence is much, much smaller and less questionable about many areas. I mean, China was, I guess, trying to lure you into an FTA negotiations. Yeah. Have been steadfast in rejecting this. So anyhow, we keep going, and Chamber supports, of course, the delegation, the Commission, in order to give the input of what we would like to have. But it looks like, as they say, the slow boat to China. Well, Jürgen Hambrecht is very familiar with China. He actually lived in Hong Kong in the 90s, and from there, started up this kind of massive investment scale that we have until today. Because of the benefit of having gone through this with you, and you have a lot of stories to tell, maybe Jürgen, you can tell how it felt like to sit 1994 in Nanjing in a hotel with this chairman of Sinopec, trying to envisage a joint venture on a napkin.
Yeah, this is a long time ago. Now, my experience goes even a little bit further back, because this was the evening of the inauguration, basically, of a joint venture. We started to negotiate at the very early of the 90s. And in the evening, let me say, two petrochemical experts have been sitting together and began brainstorming, and we just put a napkin and really wrote down the basics of this huge petrochemical complex, which we implemented after negotiations 10 years later. So it was 10 years later. But the starting point was a trust between people. And I really have to say, on the entire way through to up to today, as we are negotiating and or finally are already concluded the next big project in China at this very moment. The one and single thing I have here is trustworthiness of people and a joint strategy, which will be very thoroughly followed up. And I had this experience with Mr. Shen Huareng, who was later on a minister, and especially with Premier Zhu Rongxi, who was the godfather of this project, of the first project, until 2003. And up to today, I have contact with him. This was a great, great achievement for us. Now, reflecting a little bit on what was said before, and I see Pascal is now there as well, which I appreciate very much. I have to say it's mind-boggling that Europe has lost its importance to China, obviously, at this very moment. Because now it's a time to be open, to work together, to collaborate together on all the demanding future challenges we have. Now we have the immediate and direct challenge, which is imposed on the health of the people, which is the corona virus. But at the same time, we have climate change, we have trade patterns. And this is, I really have to say, mind-boggling, that we are coming to a point where the world is more divided than we had it before.
You can see that the word calculation on the back of an envelope, actually in BASF has an additional meaning. We actually do basic engineering on a napkin. May I just welcome Pascal for joining us. And as Jürgen Hambrecht mentioned, the individual Jürgen, who was so important to us as a company. Pascal, how important was Jürgen in your negotiations in order to get China into WTO?
Well, he was the centerpiece on the Chinese system. There was a trade minister, Shi Guangsheng, who was a sort of traditional party bureaucrat. There was Long Yong-tu, who was in MOFCOM and who was the real head of the negotiating team for China's accession to the WTO. And then at the end, it all depended on Su Wongji. And I remember this negotiation took a bit of time. There were different phases, some nice, some less nice. The problem at the origin being that given that they had concluded a deal with the Americans at the end of '99, most of the Chinese people were of the view that the EU would simply rubber stamp what they had negotiated with the US. And when I told them, thanks very much for the concessions you've done to the US, but we now have our own to-do list, which is different from the US one, because we have different comparative advantages in industry, in services, in distribution. Then the problem started. It took quite a lot of them for them to understand that we would stand firm on our own request. That wasn't bluff, which they thought it was at the beginning. And at the end of the negotiation, I had a session with Su Wongji, who, by the way, is a guy I admire a lot. Now, this guy was one of the big modernizers of China together with Deng Xiaoping. And most of his predecessors and of his successors did not have the same line that China should open in order to modernize, that this would necessitate a bit of concessions, but that was the price to pay for China's modernization. And he told me extremely clearly, in tête-à-tête, his problem. What he wanted to do is modernize China. For this, the party would provide 2/3 of the political energy. 1/3 was missing, and the third should come from elsewhere. And we, US and EU, were the third he needed, which was a very open position, which of course I liked because it gave us a good leverage to negotiate. But then the next point was, okay, I've told you my strategy, but mind you, there are things that the Politburo will accept, and there are things which the Politburo will not accept. And on your list, where we are for the moment, there are 4 things which you tell are red lines for you. Unfortunately, they are red lines for the party, including majority stakes in telecom operations, including distribution of books and oil for whatever, including distribution of cars. So on this list of 4, I can tell you I will not give you this. and you have to ask me for 4 things which I will be able to give you, which are different. So tell me, what are these 4 things? And I said, okay, I have to consult my own constituency. I have to go back to Brussels, and I'll come back next time telling you what our 4 things are. I understand your red lines. I understand you're not going to give this. The price will be when I will come back according to your request. And that's how the deal was done. The guy was incredibly strategic, incredibly clear at the end on his preferences, and I had to reveal my preferences. And we all know a negotiation is not finished as long as negotiators try to hide their real preferences in order to pay as little as possible. And I mean, all game theorists will tell you a negotiation is finished when players have revealed their real preferences. And Su Wongji was a guy to do that.
Well, he had the personality and the political clout to do this. As you mentioned, Lung Yong-tu, I had him as a speaker in 2002 after the conclusion and the session to WTO. And he took me aside and says, Jürgen, you know, your politicians always talk about win-win. We have a different concept. We win twice. And that was very interesting. Of course, he's a guy with a good sense of humor. But if the 3 of you look back at the kind of can-do attitude of the late 90s, do you see complacency here? Do you see more arrogance? Is this a zero-sum game they are playing? How come that in an age of financial crisis, one man could actually do the unthinkable in opening up the economy with the accession of WTO? And now basically we have an even more severe crisis. And I don't see this kind of energy going, or could we expect this maybe? I mean, it's a broad topic.
Shall I start, or Cecilia, you want to answer this?
Go ahead, Pascal.
Okay, so that's, of course, a large geopolitical, geoeconomic question. My answer will be, let's distinguish 3 periods with key dates: 2001, 2008, and 2020. 2001 was China joining, and this opened the period until 2008, where China remained in the same overall strategy of opening up, accepting the WTO terms of entrance, fulfilling its obligations. That was the time where the view in the rest of the world, including US and EU, was that the accession to WTO was one of the signposts of a pursuit of the Deng Xiaoping modernization, convergence, reform of the Chinese system. And by the way, it worked. During that time, the Chinese accession to the WTO resulted in the growth of Chinese imports faster than the growth of Chinese exports. And as a result of that, the external surplus, which was roughly 10% of GNP when they joined WTO, started shrinking very seriously. And we all were of the view that that was the convergence which was sort of hoped for on both sides. Then came the period 2008, let's say 2008, 2010, where there was a double change, of course, in the Chinese strategy. Because of the financial crisis in 2008, the state had to step in very vigorously back into the economy, so that the state-owned sector, which had shrunk from, let's say, 100% to 15% of the Chinese economy, restarted growing to roughly where it is now, which is 30% of the Chinese economy. So China moved back in the privatization of its economy. And this is an economic problem, and it stems from the necessity to pump an enormous amount of money to offset the depressive impact of the U.S. crisis. And then there's another development, which this one is purely political. They have roughly coincided in time, but they are not exactly linked to one another, which is the arrival of Xi Jinping, who is a Chinese leader who is much more of a traditional approach, whose purpose is to make sure that the party runs the shop and that the authority of the party runs the shop. And he has changed the constitution to remain a long life leader. And second, broken the advice of Deng Xiaoping, which is grow, become bigger, but do this silently in order not to ruffle feathers in the rest of the world. Xi Jinping changed this strategy politically and started saying, China is what you should look at if you want to modernize your country. We are successful, and it is because our system is successful. Most of the predecessors of Xi Jinping, when you talk to them in private, would say, we've done this extraordinary economic performance because we have borrowed a lot to the West. Xi Jinping believes otherwise. Xi Jinping believes China has delivered this extraordinary economic performance because of Chinese specifics, and Chinese specifics is the party. So that's the period, roughly for the last 10 years, a deviation both politically and economically from the previous course. And this is where we are now. And of course, the COVID crisis, and we all know that there remain a lot of uncertainties on the impact of this crisis, but I participate, like many of you, in lots of global conversations on this issue on, what will the world after COVID look like? As Jürgen just said, this world will be more fragmented. The US-China rivalry will be tougher. It has increased. And we Europeans have a problem in not having to choose sides, realizing that China remains a major economic thing for us. I mean, I think we all agree that the Chinese market is essential for Europe, although we still have to refine a positioning, because this strategic position of being both a partner and a rival is something which is difficult to hear. And this takes us back to the question of whether the European Union has or not the necessary clout to do that. For the moment, the Chinese have been playing the divide and rule with some success, notably with Eastern Europe. And I think the next stage is a stage where we Europeans have to increase our leverage on China, and they have to accept this. And we have to do that security-wise, trade-wise, economic-wise. And I think this is the only chance to rebalance what has been debalanced for the last 10 years.
Yeah. Cecilia? Yeah.
Well, I think if I take where Pascal ended, I think there has been a growing disappointment in the world the last year that China has not delivered on the promises they made when joining the WTO. I mean, there was a lot of optimism, there was a lot of efforts being done, but lately the reforms that the world imagined China would do have not been there when it comes to state subsidies, for instance, when it comes to the overproduction, when it comes to forced technology transfer, when it comes to other issues. And WTO has been in crisis for many years, and there's lots of things to do, and you can't blame that all on China, absolutely not. But China has benefited, as Pascal also referred to, enormously from WTO membership, and millions of people have come out of poverty because of the possibilities to trade on a global, more regulated market, and that's a good thing. But WTO is not fit to deal with that kind of state capitalist state that China is, and that's why China needs to pursue the reforms that it set out to do many years ago, and has to work with the rest of us if they want to save the multilateral system. If WTO were to collapse, we would all lose out, but China would lose a lot. So we are calling upon China to be more of a leader in this and engage with us multilateralists who still believe in the multilateral system, and we need to reform, and China needs to make continuous efforts to limit their overproduction. They need to stop the dumping. They need to stop the industrial subsidies to these state-owned companies and so on. And also, we need to work with them on this eternal question of a developing country and a developed country, where China, of course, being one of the richest countries in the world, cannot continue to define itself as a developing country and thereby not complying with WTO rules and norms and obligations. That puts developing countries to an exception there, and that's of course not sustainable. I think the COVID crisis will change a lot of the relationship between China and US and Europe, because on the one hand, of course, we are still committed to reforming the multilateral system. And here we need and we want to work with China. And China has shown sometimes that they really want to work with Europe, for instance, in trying to find a parallel appellate body when the US made it collapse in December. But the strategy of rule and divide and the strategy of very aggressive investments in some critical infrastructure is actually striking back now, and the European Union is becoming more wary of this. Yes, we want Chinese investment. Of course, we want to work economically and trade with China, but not at any price. And the investment screening mechanisms and the sort of shopping that China is now doing in some weak companies is raising concerns. Some of them are very welcome, I want to underline that, but some do raise concern. And there will be an increased wariness from the European Union, not only in rhetoric, but also in setting up some institutions and some mechanisms to limit some of these investments, and also related to the Belt and Road. We might come back to that a little bit later. And also, I mean, now the rhetoric on who started, where did the virus emerge, and how do we deal with the aftermath of the evaluation of this. There also, with the increasing sort of rhetoric war between US and China, which is appalling, because we are still talking about thousands and thousands of people dying. But here, the fake news, the propaganda, which comes from the US, but also very much from China, is also creating a more skepticism in the European Union, which I think is very unfortunate. And it will affect the trade relationship.
Jürgen, let me contribute or compliment. I think I fully concur with Patrick and Cecilia with most of it, but maybe let me put a little bit of sensitivity towards the Chinese, listening to them when they talk. First of all, especially over the last 10 years, which The Economist one said this was, let me say, globalization, no longer globalization. So we had a stagnation, not real growth. This was disappointing for all of us somehow. And this led in this Confucian way of the Chinese to learn and to assimilate what is out there and take the best out of it to different conclusion compared to our side. So one thing certainly they learned over the last years is turbo capitalism might not be favorable for China. So this is where they shifted back again to the state-owned enterprises to a certain extent. Multinational companies, for example, are setting their standards around the world, irrespective of politics or ideology. And you have a lot of different things. Certainly democracy, they also found out, is slow and is changing direction depending on leadership, which is something which is mind-boggling to almost everybody. Then protectionism, this is clear for them, is not really in favor of global trade, and certainly not favorable for China. What their conclusion out of this is certainly leadership is of essence, and this they mean politically, technologically, but also I would say economically and socially. And they have to take care of a huge amount of people out there. This is why they have changed now in their priority, addressing poverty again vis-a-vis GDP growth. And the final point I want to make here is, and this is mind-boggling for me, over the last 2-3 years, and it started also in the West because of globalization causing inequality, there is a seed of mistrust out there. Openness and transparency have gone, especially now in the coronavirus case. This is terrible. We need openness, we need transparency in order to get better around the world. It came, if you take climate change, if you take the coronavirus, it's always the same. And if we do not collaborate and cooperate openly and keep on talking, especially keep on talking, we are making big mistakes. So a little bit of an understanding for the Chinese side, I think, is necessary. Let aside, and I really emphasize what Patrick said, leadership has changed, but leadership has changed not only let me say in China to Xi Jinping, but also in the West. If you look at Trump, it's a totally different story compared to Obama. If you look into other countries around the world, we see democracy where you have constant change. Who is trustful for them? To whom to speak if it comes to Europe, for example? Yeah, these are always the same things we are facing. And the one and single thing here which comes now to the surface more and more is that for the first time, I think we are facing a really potent geopolitical competitor. And this is certainly, especially for the US leaders, a big issue. To share their preeminence is something they have not faced for a long time.
I came to China the first time nearly 40 years ago, 1982, and I was always struck by the openness and curiosity that came across. It sort of fizzled away. And for me, the defining moment was when I was handing over as president of the European Chamber in 2009, the position paper, as usual, to the former banking regulator, Lamy, who by any measure is a wonderful person, very, very open, trained in Britain. And he said to me, Jürgen, how dare you tell me how to reform my own banking system as your own system is. He was referring to this then later on again. So in a way, I think for me, 2008 to 2010, as Pascal said, is a period when we lost our sparkle, when we lost our credibility for the Chinese to have a counter model. And then now they're on their own, and possibly the double-digit growth has helped their self-esteem to get there. So, I mean, for me, the question to you would be then, how can we in Europe again get back this kind of allure, or this kind of shine, or whatever, in order to be again a model and attractive to the likes of China? Or is this absolutely a pipe dream?
Well, we don't, what we must do in Europe, and we have a long homework to do, we don't do that because of China. We need to do it because of ourselves, because of our citizens, because of our economies. And right now, the first weeks of the Corona crisis was not Europe's greatest moment, I have to say. It was a confusion. It was every country for itself. It was closing of borders. It was the export limitations of critical protective material and so on. And that was not beautiful at all. Now I think the Brussels, so to say, and the Commission has recovered a little bit. And you have to remember, and also to those who are listening to us, that the Commission does not have judicial competence in health issues. That is something that is of national responsibility. And that's what member states decided in, and that's in the treaty. But I think that Mrs. von der Leyen and her team has tried to catch up from the lost moments in the beginning, and really trying now to see how we can coordinate and how we can get out of the crisis. Now, of course, this is going to be extremely difficult, and we see how quarrels are already there on the recovery fund and the long-term budget, and what Europe should be after. And this will need some time before it is settled, but we need to make sure that Europe comes out of the crisis stronger, both when it comes to the economy, that we in a solidaric way help to build up the imminent crisis, but also long-term investment in everything from climate to innovation and growth, that we don't come out of this as a more protectionist area. And I hear some worrying sounds about this, about self-sovereignty or autonomy or so on. I mean, Europe has to trade itself out of the crisis, of course, even if there will be some changes in the trading patterns. I think that is a logical consequence, but we cannot close our borders to this. And we also have to make sure that democracy is not a victim. I mean, what's happening right now in Poland and Hungary is extremely worrying. So democracy cannot be one of the corona victims. We need to make sure that we address this. So we need to build a stronger Europe that can play its role internally, but also continue to be an important player globally, economically, as the prime defender of the multilateral system, where cooperation with China is key, of course, and many others as well. But there will be a few messy weeks and months before we land it. There are very hard internal divisions in the European Union on the economic recovery here, and that's not good, of course, but it's inevitable with the 27 countries quarreling here. And in the same time, we have the Brexit negotiations, which we might not bring into this conversation, but it also complicates matters, of course. So there will be messy times, but Europe is not the only one having those difficulties.
Got it.
I think we have to create and advertise a clear strategy vis-à-vis China. And I think that the starting point in geopolitical and geoeconomic terms remains that it is both a partner and a rival. This says that the strategy cannot be the one we had at the beginning of the year 2000, which was based on convergence. But convergence understood as China converging to us and not us converging to China. In terms of values, in terms of political systems, this is over. We cannot dream anymore of China converging to us, because this is not what the Chinese leadership wants.
Never wanted.
The Chinese leadership wants the CPC to remain the main backbone of the Chinese society, economy, political system. This is something which we cannot accept for philosophical reasons. So drop convergence and move to what you do when you cannot converge, but you're still faced with an indispensable interlocutor, which is coexistence. So the name of the strategic game with China is coexistence. This is not the US line. The US line is, let's push back China. China has become a threat for the United States of America. This is now deeply entrenched into Washington system, Republicans, Democrats, moderate Republicans, moderate Democrats. This will not change if Trump is not reelected. We are not on the same strategy. We are, I think, on a strategy of coexistence. Second, in a strategy of coexistence, we have to get stronger vis-à-vis China, because otherwise they don't take us seriously. They are extremely pragmatic. They get their things done. They are not bothering about big things. They build power relations and they use them. And by the way, this is what they are doing with the Silk Road, the BRI, the Asian, the Investment Bank. They are trying to build a parallel system to the inherited World War II big system with Chinese characteristics. What's the BRI? And I think it's much clearer, by the way, after COVID. The BRI is a Chinese-driven system of global supply chains. So this is their strategy. We have to acknowledge this. We have to get stronger, and stronger in the case of Europe is very simple. We have to speak with not only one voice, but one mouth. And the big problem we have with the Chinese, I'm sorry to say, is that we are very poorly organized at EU level to talk to the Chinese. The European Trade Commissioner is a higher level than the Chinese Trade Minister. So, but it's a lower level than the Vice Premier in charge of G20 and trade. So the European Trade Commissioner, and I hope Cecilia will not say I'm totally wrong, is somewhere between somebody who's too low and somebody who's too high. The Vice President of the Commission is too low for the Chinese Vice Premier, but the President of the Commission is too low for the Chinese President, but too high for the Chinese Prime Minister. So we have a whole problem of interlocutors, which, by the way, the US do not have. You know that in the US, the interlocutor of Xi Jinping is the president. The interlocutor of Yue is Nuchin, and the interlocutor of Lighthizer is also Yue. So I'm sorry to enter into these machine rooms details, but we have a big problem in order to be taken seriously, because there's not the right door to knock in Brussels. And when we want to knock the door, we knock to a door which is either too low or too high. So we have to fix this, of course, be more united. And then we have to work on the two areas where I think this relation of partner and rival are clearly to be addressed, which is trade and investment and environment. I think these are the two areas where we can build a balanced relationship. On trade, do both ways. We have to resist to US pressures on export controls to China, which are going to grow. Look at what happened recently with this new legislation that obliges people who produce chips with machines which are partly produced in the US for licenses for the chip making that follows in the supply chain. This, look at the US attitude to Huawei. We cannot follow the US on such a pushback, geopolitically aggressive position. But on the other side, we clearly have to reinforce our trade defense mechanisms. Cecilia, although she's a trade liberal in the big Nordic tradition, did that, which says a lot on the necessity to do it. We have to be better at controlling investments in a series of critical or strategic sectors. So we have something which is balanced. And same on environment, we have to push the Chinese to accelerate their road to a decarbonized economy, which for the moment is way longer than ours. And this is a problem. And this is why, by the way, we will also need to discuss with them on border carbon adjustments, carbon clubs, and so on. There's a whole area there where we can, because in trade and investment and in environment, what our comparative advantage is our size and the size of our market. And this is our base for international cloud. I hope it will go to other areas, but we have to start from where we are strong, which is our market. And we still have a market which is larger than the Chinese market. It's less wide, but it's more deep because we are richer. So we have 10 or 20 years to do that. And I think this should be a very clear strategy. And we should not have this in secret. We should say, this is what we want. This is our comparative advantage. This is what we understand the Chinese want. I think this is the only solution for really being able to deal with them in a better and more considered relationship.
Jürgen, maybe a compliment from, let me say, operationally looking from a company point of view. Also, I'm sitting only on the supervisory board and not being operational anymore. So here, two comments. First, listening very carefully, Patrick, to what you said. You know, we have this in bilateral negotiations with the Chinese, but also on sometimes with the Americans or anybody, the same problem that on the same level, you have to talk on the same level, which is, I think, foolish. One can talk on different levels and still can achieve something. Even a CEO can talk with a person on the working bench, if necessary, and sometimes very, very helpful. So the water carrier for the Tour de France guys, yeah, are very, very important sometimes. And if you accept them, I think this is something one needs to look into. And it should be easy for Europe to define a person who just is responsible for that. And so we go. Second point I have here, which is a little bit of a concern as we talk about trade, or let me say the coexistence. What we see at this very moment, and you address the chip issue, or we take the 5G issue, is different standardization procedures and different standards. What we can see at this very moment is that you may be forced to have a standard for the Western, or let me say the American hemisphere, and a standard for the Chinese or the Eastern hemisphere. And this is why for them, for example, these FTA agreements with Korea and Japan are more important than compared to Europe, because they don't know where Europe stands at this point in time. So whatever we can do to generate global standardization is of utmost importance to enforce free trade.
Yeah, if I may react very shortly on this, Jürgen. First, my Christian name is Pascal, but Patrick I like.
Pascal, of course, sorry.
Irish Christian name. So very, very similar. On this, I agree with you that there is a problem of standardization in the digital world, which was much easier to solve in the traditional industries. The food, the car, the machinery. The problem being, of course, that standards in the digital have a lot to do with data, and our philosophy on data is different in US, Europe, and China. So I think forget for the moment, for the next 10 or 20 years, a global standard on data, whether it's localization, whether it's privacy, whether it's accessibility, whether it's transfer. It's an area where I think, again, coexistence is the name of the game and not convergence. And then you have the problem of the sort of dual use nature of digital systems, which puts us under severe US pressure, because for security reasons, the US will try to decouple which is what Trump started even pre-COVID, the US and the Chinese supply chain systems in the tech sector. And on this, we have a proper EU challenge because we have to have our own security standards. We have to have our own view of how much can we integrate with the Chinese production systems in goods and services which are digital. And on this, I'm not sure EU has a clear idea where it wants to go, but I would not bet, Jürgen, I would not bet on global standards in the digital world the way I did for food, car equipment, toys, lighters, and the rest.
May I just state that for the audience, now's the time to chip a question our way. We have my colleague Jacob here, who's going to screen it and then basically throw it at our panel. Cecilia, as you were trying to work with Japan and the US to remove WTO rules on industrial subsidization, investment screening, as Pascal just said, what happened afterwards? Is the US totally gone for us? How important is Japan in this? Where do we find allies, my question?
Well, we have a lot of allies who strongly believe that the multilateral system is in need of reform, modernization, updating, but worth saving and worth defending. Japan is an obvious ally in that, and the EU-Japan free trade agreement is the most ambitious trade agreement ever done, actually. And Japan has emerged as a friend and ally in more ways than we thought before we had the agreement. And with Japan, we've been working with the US on a ministerial level. It was the Japanese foreign minister and Mr. US Chair Lighthizer and myself trying to see if we could draft proposed rules for industrial subsidies that we would then share with the rest of the WTO membership. And we achieved quite a lot there. That is now, there is a proposal. And I know that Phil Hogan, my successor, has started to share that with other friends in WTO. And then, of course, we need to discuss with China, because we cannot provide them this, sign the dotted line. This is a dialogue that has to be going on with China. And I think EU and Japan are maybe at this moment a little bit more suited to have that conversation. We also started to have discussions on industrial on forced technology transfer and others. This is more technically complicated, but discussions are ongoing actually. On investment screening, the US have a very sophisticated CFIUS mechanism that they have been updating. Japan has another one, but also Australia, Mexico, Canada, lots of countries have been updating their current legislation. And we had, in the European Union, half of the member states had a national one, but we've been working to set a common platform and an information sharing system with joint criterias. And there we had good cooperation with the Treasury in the US, with Japan, with Canada and others to get inspired from what they had, even if the one Europe has is a less ambition because of judicial competencies that the Commission cannot decide whether investment should take place or not. But that the new Commission has already said that it will be reinforced, the mechanism. And I think not only vis-a-vis China, this is a non-discriminatory. Some countries are also worried about other big powers investing. But I think this will be sharpened in the light of the Corona crisis as well. And we've had good cooperation here. So there is cooperation ongoing. We have a small, limited, but still positive agenda with the US. I would have hoped that would have been bigger. We still have some profound disagreements, of course, but you need to find, like with the EU and China, you need to find those positive agendas where you can, despite your differences, cooperate and find a way forward. And I mean, the climate issue is an obvious candidate, but also in trade and in reforming WTO and so on.
Just ask Jacob to throw a question at you. I'm sure they have better questions than I did.
All right.
You're doing fine, Jürgen.
All right, I'm going to combine a couple of questions because they're related. One from, and one from, oh, there you go. It disappeared. Interesting. Sorry about that. Oh, one from Rosanna, sorry. So considering the sort of disunity within the European Union, or at least the perception of it, and that China often seems to prefer to deal with individual member states or through things like the 17+1, but that there's also a clear need, as you've all stated, for the EU to kind of speak with a common voice, and in order to navigate this new environment. How can the EU help create that kind of common voice, considering its kind of internal politics?
Well, I mean, I think the answer to this question is that the ones that so far have indulged in playing their own cards with China instead of playing the EU card must be convinced, either by reasoning or by other means, that this is not the good solution for them long term. There's little real retaliation or power instrument to put this sort of member states in line, and the 17+1 is a clear aggression by the Chinese on the EU integration, which shows that they are ready to play it both ways when they need to play it both ways. I think this is a domestic issue. We have among ourselves to move in the direction of one position, one interlocutor. And as Cecilia said a moment ago, this is our homework. We cannot complain not to be treated seriously by the Chinese in a number of occasions if we remain so divided in a number of areas. This has to be absolutely clear. And we have to create a situation which is the Chinese system back to where it was 20 years ago. 20 years ago, they had started putting their chips in Brussels and removing their chips from member states. If you look at the staffing of their diplomatic system, if you look at the level of expertise, if you look at this was reversed after 2010. I will tell you a small anecdote, which I think can go roughly public. When I was DG of WTO, that was in 2009 and 10, the Chinese president sent to me a personal envoy to have a conversation not about WTO, not about trade, not about China, but about what was happening in Europe. And the guy, and I will not give the name of the guy, of course, started the conversation in saying, Mr. DG, I have one question for you from President Hu Jintao at the time. And the question is, where did we Chinese get it wrong? And I said, what do you mean? What did we? Well, we thought EU would become a big Germany, and we are seeing that EU is becoming a big Greece. So we got it wrong. Please tell us where we got it wrong. Typical, absolutely typical Chinese attitude, the sort of modesty in the fact, they got it wrong. But of course, the question was going to the core of the issue, which is what explained this change. And I probably was not convincing enough. And from this moment on, and with the 08 crisis, they started re-putting their resources in national embassies, starting with the big shots in the European Union, the name of which I don't need to repeat. And this was a very clear shift. We have to create a situation where they go back to staffing properly, restaffing their Brussels headquarters, their power system in Brussels, and not in member states. This, I think, is the benchmark. It's like, it's like a temperature. we have an instrument to measure this, and this is the instrument.
But this, if I may, Jürgen, of course, we need to have a joint strategy vis-à-vis China and many other countries. But if the European Union really wants to become a real geopolitical player, as is the ambition of this Commission, we need to change the way we make decisions. In trade, EU is a political power because we can take decisions on a majority basis. It is the Commission who speaks on behalf of all the countries. When it comes to foreign policy, and foreign policy, of course, today is so much more than diplomacy and external politics. It is also science, innovation, G5, environment. That's what we need a strategy. But when it comes to pure foreign policy, we are still not stronger than the weakest link of the foreign ministers. And that's why we need to move towards a system where we can make majority decisions in the foreign policy. This is a tricky issue. This would require treaty changes. I am not by any way underestimating the huge difficulties here, but if we're moving towards treaty changes and a big discussion on the future, this is a topic that has to be addressed. Because if you really want to play a role in a world where geopolitics and trade and economics and politics are entering into a mishmash of a world where old institutions and international organizations have weakened, the EU needs to find a role there, and we can only do that by speaking with one voice, and therefore we need to change the way we make decisions.
Great. Question from Simon Lacey. So there's been a strong emphasis on the importance of trust in the EU-China relationship. How would the panelists qualify the level of trust between China and the EU now compared to previously? And what trends do you sort of see the level of trust moving in the near and long-term future?
And may I direct this to Jürgen? Trust China, Europe, as you have been advising Merkel. If I just add on this layer of China, Merkel, Europe, how you see this kind of level of trust?
Now I have to say I am out of this environment for quite some time, but what I see and read, this is what I can comment on. First, to the discussion before, Pascal and Cecilia finger pointed, we need to have a strategy in Europe for China. Unless we do not have this strategy, there will be no voice. And there has to be a commitment by the major leaders, especially Macron and Merkel, and beyond, most probably Italian and the Spanish and the Polish. Now, this certainly is not easy. One has to somehow write it down and to agree upon it. And to write it down, I think it's not so easy for most of the member states. And it comes then to your question, Jürgen. Angela Merkel certainly is a highly trusted person in China, as far as I have experienced, and as far as I know from today. I think most probably she is the person the Chinese would address it if it comes to Europe. And as Pascal said, it's not a big Germany, Europe, it is something else. And it has to be addressed. And this can only be done via a jointly developed strategy, taking in consideration all what was discussed before. On the other side, China, from my knowledge, they have always had a very clear strategy. And surprisingly, if we have usually strategies in Europe and the respective countries, we are not, this is for, let me say, very often not really taken to execution. It's just written down and then muddling through. The Chinese, on the contrary, are following up very, very consequent and persistently on their strategies. And they have a strategy for Europe. The 70+1 is one of them. They would just like to take one person and talk through most of their issues and come to certain conclusions and a better in an understanding, and then somehow assimilate to their needs, not really looking into what Pascal said, a coexistence type of approach. Going forward, I personally, now this is my personal comment as I see Europe at this very moment, hopefully COVID-19 will pull together Europe and not divide it further. For the time being, the European Commission has not come to a very clear positioning towards all the topics we have addressed at this very moment. And it's urgent, it's high time, and should be now addressed, especially from the top by von der Leyen.
I mean, we have Merkel taking over the presidency of the European Council on July 1st, and she actually said that she's very keen to put China on top of the list. She actually has planned to come to Beijing on July 9th with Ursula von der Leyen in order to kickstart the process. And as Cecilia pointed out, then sort of, you know, crowning it in Leipzig with an investment agreement. Now this all looks very, very shaky. We know that Merkel will not be long in Germany as chancellor anymore. But maybe I go to something else before we have another question from our members. The observation I have is that China imperial thinking, as they have it, are thinking along the lines of spoken hub. It's me, China big, you small. And it's very telling. In 17+1, the spoken hub experience, there seems to be very little multilateral thinking behind this. And of course, Belt and Road is a similar scheme. It is us, China, signing deals with countries, Italy, the last big one, on a Belt and Road initiative, and then basically having the control in this bilateral agreement. There's actually no phone number for multilateral setting. Is this something where we have to get used to? Or is this also something where we can then sort of turn it around and say, guys, don't you see how we are separated in the, let's find a common denominator, and maybe the fact that China is so robust might help us to get this coalition going.
My own answer to that, I mean, takes us back to the question of trust and this delicate strategic determination between partner and rival. And in terms of strategy, well, first, I believe EU should remain as much as possible distant from excesses on the US side and on the Chinese side. There's one place where we can do that, which is WTO, where I think the strategy has been, this was Cecilia's strategies, it's Phil Hogan's strategies, keep the US under the tent and bring the China more into the tent. That's the strategy. If the US create a problem, let's side with China to fix this problem. If China creates a problem, let's side with the US to fix this problem. And by the way, this is what happened with the dispute settlement system. The patch, the fix that was found, this provisional solution to have a dispute settlement system working without the US was engineered by the EU as a sort of middle way between China and US, and is an area where we, EU, have proven that we can take a leadership and get things done in the areas where we have a real clout. Now, back to the trust question, I think the main thing is we need to find a few areas with China where we succeed in doing things together. With the Chinese people, trust comes not from philosophy, it comes from a working relationship where they get what they want, we get what we want, we've done something together, we can show we've been something together. And there are a few areas in the area of research science, for instance, where there is a very long-term cooperation between EU and China, where we have things of this kind. And I personally believe that the area where we should invest much more, we did it, I think, reasonably, although not forcefully enough, is environment. EU providing technical assistance to China so that they can build a Chinese ETS system is a great thing to do. The moment we can say EU and China have a view that this is a big problem which we need to address together, and we are doing it in a similar and convergent way. It's moving from coexistence to convergence in some areas. And I think we should, within the strategy, which, I mean, I think we framed something which is a little more convincing and precise than the paper that was done by the external service some time ago in this conversation. We should complement it by a few areas which we test with the Chinese. We tell them, we want to get some results in getting things done. Let's talk about this A, B, C, D. Do you have other suggestions? And then we work in a 2, 3 year, 4, 5 year program, and we get things done, which on both sides, we can convince our constituencies that we don't have to choose between being partners or being rivals.
Okay, I think we go for the next question then.
Yep. Our next question is from Paul Sives. He's the chair of our Southwest China chapter. There seem to be more calls coming from within the EU for Europe to become more independent from Chinese supply chains. Does the panel consider it likely that the EU or member states may impose some sort of tariffs or additional barriers to help facilitate this, as the Americans attempted to do? And if not, what sort of mechanisms do you think may be utilized to try to achieve that?
Cecilia, as you're not in office anymore, maybe you can just be at the liberty of disclosing what could be.
Well, first of all, I think some of the companies around Europe have already on their own realized that they need to diversify their dependence. The cheap production of certain equipment or technical or what have you in Asia and China was very cheap some time ago, but that has, it has sort of survived itself a little bit. And with this crisis, I think many countries are now looking at, rather than decoupling, which is a more political word, diversifying, which is a more economic word in the company's word, and you know more about that, you who are listening and who are here, trying to see, can we diversify to other countries in China, in Asia, how about Brazil, Mexico, depending on the product, of course. And this we already see going on, and I have a lot of anecdotal evidence of this only the last weeks, and I think that will continue. I really hope that the European Union would not impose new tariffs. Setting export limitations to medical equipment was a mistake. That was not a good thing to do, and it sent a very strange signal to the rest of the world as well. But of course, there will be some strategic assets where you will look if you can take the production a little bit closer home, in the medical area, in the pharma area. But what we should do, but I don't know if this is feasible, but what should be done is to rather see if we can at least temporarily eliminate all tariffs on pharma products, on medical equipment, on protective equipment all over the world, because the crisis is not over, and we will need in solidarity to help all of the world to get access from everything from soap to gloves to respirators or ventilators. I know that some countries are voicing this and business supports it, but I don't know if it will happen. It would be very unfortunate if we started to put tariffs on. On the contrary, we should make sure that the trade agreements that we have or are negotiating, that they come into place so that we can actually have a framework where we can diversify shopping, the needs of our different services and equipment. But I think there is a discussion internally in Brussels going on which way to talk, but business have certainly started to move already on their own to start diversifying.
Jürgen, may I comment just for a second? I think from an operational point of view, those who are acting globally, they have already addressed this for a long time. So the basic concept is produce where you sell your products. So basically what we produce in China is sold to China. What we produce in North America is sold to US. So avoiding also kind of tariffs, where there's always uncertainty. So to circumvent this, you really have to look into your supply chains, what is necessary and what is still competitive first. Second, now looking at it from a more strategic point of view and looking into countries, many countries do have their strategic reserves in very essential basic products. For example, oil and gas. Many countries do have their strategic reserves. Now with this experience from Corona, one needs to think about strategic reserves in the medical field, I think. We got cost pressure on the health systems all over the world is so immense that economy of scale is #1 priority. And very often you have then active ingredients for pharma only produced in one place in the world to the amount which is necessary to stay competitive. This will have to be reconsidered, I think. So strategy will define in which areas there need to be strategic reserves. And then you look into the supply chain, where to produce it. Always having a second source, certainly, and finally, not building on tariffs. I 100% with Cecilia on this one.
I mean, I'm with both Cecilia and Jürgen on this. I think there is more talk than walk on this issue of fragility of supply chains. Because I don't think there's any serious determination at this stage on where are these supply chains fragile. How do you measure the fragility or the resilience of and this is a discussion which we need to have to explain our policy, both internally and outside. So we need to be clear on where do we believe this fragility needs to be addressed. The medical sector, maybe one. Some parts of the tech sector, maybe one. At least we have one big asset in this conversation that we can give a European answer to that. So that we can have it sort of both ways. We have the sort of security which repatriating, reshoring provides, but we have this at a scale which is the EU scale, which is a much bigger scale where compromises of this kind make sense. Now, then there is the problem of assuming we have identified the problem, which I think for the moment we haven't properly done. We're all in the big political talk. Once we've landed this into a simple set of criteria on which we can agree, then we have to go to either inventories, which Jürgen mentioned. After all, we've had that for oil since the 70s. Why don't we have that for medical equipment? Or even for some areas in food, which may make sense. And then there is the question of diversification. But let's not kid ourselves. This will be slow and costly.
Yes.
And we have to be clear that this cost will have to be paid by somebody. Is it by the taxpayer? Is it by the consumer? Is it by the stakeholder? Is it by the wage owner? This discussion we cannot hide. Yeah. And to answer clearly, and I think Cecilia will agree on me, I don't think using tariffs is the right way to do that. because if we use tariff, we immediately open the way to retaliation from others. We may have some fragilities in our supply chains, but others may have some fragilities in supply chains which integrate Europe into the supply chain. This is not a one-way street. Supply chains, by definition, may be very large. So I would not refuse the discussion. There will have to be a bit of that, although in the case of masks and PPEs, stocks would have been the real solution and much less costly than changing the whole supply chain. There will be a bit of that, but let's be serious, transparent, and again, strategically determined with an open strategy, not least so that businesses know what to do. After all, they have their own view of where their supply chains may necessitate more resilience. Public authorities may have their own views, and then we have to discuss them with them.
I think we have just time for one more question. So Jacob, give us best of the best.
Yeah, so there was previously about the kinds of red lines that the Chinese side was unwilling to cross. And a couple of attendees have asked, where are Europe's red lines in its economic relationship with China? And are there any red lines with China that might be different or, perhaps extra that you wouldn't have with, say, a trading partner like Canada, a fellow democracy?
Our red lines are clearly political. They are about values, they are about democracy, they are about human rights, they are about freedom, they are about the independence of the judiciary, they are about a set of principles which are the front piece of what we have as an EU constitution. We have a system which is based on rule, on law, on philosophy, on principles. We will not accept this to be compromised. And this is where, by the way, again, we have to organize coexistence, because the Chinese leadership, for the moment, and as long as Xi Jinping will remain the leader, which may be 10 or 15 years, will not accept to compromise on what they call Chinese specificities, which is a political system which is run by the CPC. So this is a zone where no compromise is possible. We have to dialogue, we have to try and understand, and there is a whole layer of history, civilization, philosophy, art, poetry, and the rest behind these things, which we have, of course, to be aware of and to try to understand. But there are red lines of this kind. As far as economic relationship is concerned, we have to be clearer on what is European sovereignty. And it's not easy because, I'm old enough to remember that talking about European sovereignty 20 years ago was having strange visions from having smoked something wrong. Now we know that we are in a process of defining. It's going to be slow because our concept of sovereignty may not be the same. If Cecilia and me have a long discussion about sovereignty, it will take a bit of time before we exactly agree on the same terms, for obvious reasons. So, not least because my compatriots are very familiar with this concept, which still is a bit wary for other cultures. And I think we have to understand this. But, so red lines in politics, our values, our constitution, and in economic terms, a more serious, probably a bit tougher definition of what European sovereignty is. I totally agree with Jürgen when he said at the beginning that the world post-COVID would be more difficult, more tense, more fragmented, and with a higher level of US-China rivalry, we can only preserve our own values and interests in integrating the European Union more. And by the way, this is where the jury is still out. Whether recovery plan of 1.5 trillion will appear, will work, because that's what the matter is, not to have a plan. It's to have a plan which works. This will be crucial in the weeks to come. This is not directly related to the Chinese relationship, but it is one more of these conditions to establish a proper balance of power, in my view.
100% agreed.
Absolutely.
Yeah. As we are running out of time, last week we had a session with Peter Mandelson, Timothy Gardner-Nash, and George Magnus, and to surprise them with a question. So I tried the same effect on you. If you would just assume that you are fluent in Chinese and you can talk to the Politburo members here, what, in 1 or 2 sentences, what kind of advice would you give them?
Engage more with us in Europe and others to preserve and reform the multilateral system. Show more leadership, do some concessions without necessarily compromising with all your convictions, but work with us to reform and stabilize the multilateral system.
Yeah, my advice would be long-term, China's interest is for the world to integrate more. Mm. And in order to do that, you need to step forward in a number of areas. And you have to understand that big shots, and now you're one of these big shots, have to pay apparently a bit more than small shots to get there. Look at the history of European integration. Look at what happened this week with Germany. This is the way things happen. And please believe that China on its own, 20, 30, 50, 100 years from now, will be worse off than China integrating in the world. It's complex because differences, but integration remains the name of the game. And we Europeans have a bit of credibility when we explain to China that 100 years from now, the world should integrate a bit like what we did. We have an experience in integration, which they listen to. It's the same, by the way, with the Africans in some areas. And this is also a comparative advantage we have. So, and of course, then the answer will be, but let's look at the US. They are trying to damage us. They are trying to damage the Chinese system, the Chinese economy, the Chinese evolution. And we have to say, this is not our purpose. Of course, saying this clearly will necessitate quite a bit of work within the European countries.
So no, my point would be here, China first and America first will not succeed. So go back to very traditional Confucianism, learn, assimilate, and get better and take the best out of the world and help your people to have a better well-being.
Thank you, Jürgen. That was a perfect ending. Let me just thank you on behalf of the members for this sparkling 90 minutes, as long as the soccer game, but we didn't have halftime. I would just like to use this as a commercial for the next event, which is next Tuesday. We have the sitting EU Commission of Environment, we have Isabel Hilton, an old China hand from the UK, who is managing the China dialogue, and we have possibly the best Chinese NGO on environment, Ma Jun from the Institute of Public Environmental Affairs, the gentleman who has single-handedly developed website on air and water emissions and other issues. That is going to be very interesting next Tuesday. Tune in. So with that, again, thank you for participating in our birthday party, and I wish you all the best back home in Europe.